Hello, so it's time to talk about pressure. What pressure is, how it affects us in our performance, and how we can then deal with it to try to allow it to affect our performance less. And finally, one of the ideas, a very stigmatized idea in society in general that also impacts us here a little bit. So firstly, I apologize, my beard is scraggly. I asked the barber, I said, hey, we've got 15 minutes. I'm growing it still, just neaten it up. Just, just cut off some straight hairs and stuff. Lean back, takes off 2/3 of it. Of course, why wouldn't he? I mean, the thing is, like, when you lean back, you're probably asking, like, how did this happen? Once you're leaning back, your eyes are closed. That's the point where you've trusted them. You trusted that what you said to them, they've understood it, and they're going to execute. You put your head back, you close your eyes, and you feel that razor real close, man. Way too close. Shouldn't be that close, but it was. In that single first touch, that's the end. That is the end. You gotta live with it. And I may or may not have tipped him. Anyway, so away from biz and back to the subject at hand. Pressure is really, really interesting. It's something that we all experience in all areas of our lives. And essentially, pressure is having an invested value of some description. And so, for example, if you're a professional player, you've invested a lot of time, you've invested a lot of effort, you've invested a lot in your identity, in your reputation. You have a big investment from the team that's supporting you, the fans, the organization as well that's paying you a salary. These are all things where it's directly tied to this let's say your execution of your skills, and it's tied to that from an investment and value perspective. So you have a super high investment, super high value to actually perform, to make sure that all those expectations are met. And that can really weigh on you, and especially when you're on stage, that's when it matters the most, because that one moment of a success or a fuck up will, it may mean all the money, all the fame, a break in your career, all this kind of stuff, or the continued slump, the continued sort of bad emotions that maybe you've been feeling because of slumps and so on. So there's a lot going on to create pressure in our minds as human beings. Now we need to think about how it affects our performance. So the thing about our performance is that, generally speaking, it's all about heuristics. So heuristics is about, over time, you're gaining all this information, all this knowledge from playing the game over and over and over again. All this information that's just being absorbed by your brain, all these small little bits of data that you barely even take in. Well, you don't take in consciously much of it, although a lot of it you will want to pass through consciously, and this is actually an important aspect of effective and proper practice. But when you're actually in the execution mode, the most efficient way to do that is to have your subconscious just doing everything you've done in practice. It's the motor memory. You've basically coded into your brain exactly how you want to respond in a bunch of different situations, and it's also interpreted and sort of it creates learned intuition in that sense, as it picks up loads of data and it just knows something. And I'm sure you guys have played a game of CS, Quake, whatever it is, StarCraft fighting games, where you just knew that this was true, that something was true, and you acted on it in a split second, and you don't even know, you wouldn't be able to explain it, and you don't know why, but you did it in a split second, and it was absolutely the right call. And you experience this with motor memory as well, like all those moments when someone's popped on screen your periphery and you flick to them before you've consciously registered. They are there and they are dead. We've all loved those moments. You feel like a badass, you feel like a superhero. It's great. And that's what being in the zone is like, and that's what flow state is like, and that's where you want to be. That's why preparedness and practice is so important, because it's all about how you actually train your body, your brain rather, and your body to have these responses, and it's all linked to heuristics in that way. So what happens is, and by the way, one thing to think, like one way to think about this or conceptualize this, the subconscious here, is that it's this element of our brains which has a huge degree of bandwidth and can send and receive data very quickly at once. Now, the interesting thing here is that the conscious mind is very myopic. It's very tunnel vision. It's very narrow in comparison. If we try to think about things consciously, it's very difficult to get the answer. It can be very hard, and sometimes, and there's lots of different problems that can come up with that. For example, if anyone's ever done a Sudoku or generally any sort of logic problem at all, we can often start with sort of like initial biases where we're sort of looking for specific solutions because we think that's the way that this makes sense. And we are looking for that solution so hard that we can't see the actual solution, even though it could be staring us right in the face. And this is, again, what's happening is a narrowing of the data because we're basically passing it through all the data through a much narrower structure and expectation. Whereas when you're sort of just operating from the subconscious, you don't really have any biases, and your brain is much more easily able to sort of receive all the data and sort of interpret it and basically apply the intuition very, very quickly. Again, another example of this and something that you're doing when you're playing and you don't even think about it is that, let's say when you're in a 1v1 and then there's a guy, you know, standing in a particular position on the map and you're standing there, you know he's got a particular weapon. What does that tell you? You know, particular types of, you know, reload times, you know, what he's going to be, what kind of angles he might want to take, what is actually in the metagame and how he understands what the metagame is as well, maybe how he's playing off of that, how the geometry affects your movement, you're constantly movement and you're doing movement and you're sort of counter strafing at the same time. You're trying to gain more information, and all these things are happening. Like, and there's many more as well. You know, you're moving your hands, your fingers, your wrists, your arms. You know, all these things are happening very quickly, like you're a master pianist or musician of some description, and you can't do that, like all those things, you know, individually at the same time with your conscious brain. Really, like that's not something that really happens. So essentially, what pressure does is pressure brings your conscious brain into the fray in spots where you don't want it to be in the fray. You want to just be acting from all the way back here in that subconscious mind with that massive bandwidth, just doing, just executing, just being of the moment. And instead, you know, pressure's like, you know, I know if I fuck this up, you know, there's so much, you know, value and investment here. You know, I'm going to let my fans down. I'm going to let my peers down. I haven't been doing very well lately. I really need this result. Or I've been having a bad day. I need this result. Or I'm having a good day and I expect to get this result. And you know, but maybe like, you know, I'm in a really bad situation, you know, whatever it might be, whatever the betrayal of the value or the investment might be, that's going to be bringing you more into thinking about the future. And how do we do that? We do it with our conscious mind, with our inner voice, which is our conscious mind sort of, you know, presenting thoughts and so on and so forth. So that's the main problem, really, is that you're basically essentially limiting you're throttling your bandwidth. I think that's the best way or the most analogous way for me to describe it in the way that I see things and I conceptualize. So how do we deal with this? You know, that's one thing we need to understand here. So exposure is one of the best ways to deal with stuff, because generally speaking, any new thought, emotion, feeling that we have as human beings, it's very scary when we first get them because we're in the unknown. We don't know exactly what it means existentially. You know, what is this feeling? Like, what does it mean to me and my identity and who I am in the world and what's happening to me and what does that mean, you know, around me and so on and so forth. Like, that's what a new feeling generally is. And so it's kind of scary because you just don't know how to pass it, and you don't know exactly what the expectations are or how other people handle it, or, you know, how everything works. So I remember when I first experienced, you know, pressure for the first time, I was playing a cup. There's no expectation to win. I was just in a tournament setting and I was like, oh my God. I know, I just had loads of pressure, maybe because I had huge expectations about, you know, what it could mean if I even got a frag, or like, I was like, oh, I'm finally doing it, I'm finally competing, I'm finally like playing a tournament, this is going to be my first placement, I hope it's not super shit, although I actually ran into like one of the best players at the time in the first round in one of my first tournaments, but I was like shaking, I couldn't like do anything, I literally couldn't do anything, I was just shaking. It's a crazy like biofeedback mechanism where, you know, I was just so anxious here, it just manifests itself physically, and the biofeedback is really interesting. I might make another video about that at some point. Anyway, so this is, you know, exposure. As you expose yourself over time, your brain's like, oh, okay, I understand what's happening here. I have a reference point of how I felt last time, and I've, you know, thought about it a little bit. It's not really such a big deal. Everything's fine, and you start to get used to it. And, you know, life is good. You still feel pressure, but you'll normalize as, you know, the more exposed you get to it. So that's one way to do it. And that's, you know, generally the only way that people tend to think about it. It's just do it until you get used to it. Some people obviously are quite naturally good at handling pressure. But another thing that I think is incredibly helpful for pressure is good preparedness in your decision making. Because, you know, as they say, right, you know, if you fail to prepare, you prepare to fail. But what I mean here is the fact that when you're playing, you have all kinds of different situations where you might want to be thinking with your conscious mind. Now, the thing is that if you're let's imagine a supernaturally skilled and talented player like Simple, he's thinking so intuitively. I would be very surprised if most of the plays he makes, he's really thinking when he makes those plays. He's just doing those plays because they're intuitive. They're inherently intuitive to him because he has an incredible mind. Like, he has an incredible mind for the game. It doesn't necessarily mean he has an incredible mind for mathematics or for, social intelligence or for, music or whatever it might be. But for this particular game, we know that he has an incredible mind for it, and he just intuits stuff very, very well. Whereas most people, it's about sort of training sort of a learned intuition, like giving your brain all the data to then slowly over time see patterns and understand behaviors and then it creates models to pass the data through, which is then your heuristics. It's then how your body or your mind responds to all of that data, which is again another reason why it's so important to not be in this kind of myopic sort of realm where it's just our conscious brain constantly thinking, because then you don't get all the information you need to have to really do the learned intuition justice. So the reason why the decision making is really important is because then we get like a play like Device, okay? And Device is a really cool example as well, because we know that with Astralis, choking has been a thing for them in the past, and choking often comes down to pressure, and it's there's a lot of very complex things here from a psychological perspective. Actually, the very label is in of itself, from a psychological perspective, a very big deal. If you ever sort of have this inherent belief that you are a choker because enough of the data correlates and feels congruent to that fact, it's very hard to disroot that. And so you got to be very careful with any kind of label that you apply to yourself or that others apply to you, because it can actually end up being a self-fulfilling prophecy. Anyway, moving back into to Device as the example and how he handles this in this particular mode. I imagine Device has many ways, many self-tailored ways to handle pressure, but we all know him to be a very tactical and prepared player, and this is something that we can absolutely look to him for regarding consistency. And so this is really cool because he knows exactly what he's going to do in every position that he plays. When he plays a position defensively on the CT side, he knows these are the kinds of grenades that I can throw from this position. These are the kinds of positions my teammates will have. This is the kind of rounds, and in this kind of round, I know that I should be thinking about this. I should be applying this kind of strategy to the round, and these are the supporting tactics for this strategy. I know sort of what kinds of players I'm going to be playing against, and in so doing, I'm informed as to, again, I can further refine some of the decision-making trees I already have to already make the decision almost like before the game has even started. He has all the decision trees. He just picks one and commits to it. And this is very similar to good clutch players. Good clutch players, when they're in the clutch, what they do is they have a very specific amount of time where they're gathering information, and then once they've gathered the information, they commit to the play. And this is why the game is much more analogous to poker than it is, like, people say chess, because you have imperfect information in poker and you have to make the best decision at the time, and you basically have to take the risk. So you can't look everywhere, and this is you can tell someone hasn't thought about a clutch if they're looking everywhere, or if they're looking in one place, which doesn't make sense then if they look into another location, because that exists. There's certain spots where, like, you have to really be convinced and committed that they're there, and you just have to gamble that and just be okay that if your deduction was wrong, that then fuck it, you'll improve your deductive abilities for the next time, and then you'll have a better situation. But by doing that process, by committing to the decision already, you're creating a spot where hesitation can't come into your mind. And hesitation comes into your mind when you're unsure. And you're unsure because you can't be sure. You can't be sure. That's why you have to commit, because there's so many unknowns and so many, and the player is trying to outsmart you and play against you. So you have to commit to decisions before you get into the scenario, and this can be very helpful because it can allow you to sort of just stay in the execution mindset, as opposed to be like bringing more thoughts into the conscious brain as you try to interpret, how do I handle this situation? So preparedness is very important, and so this is another reason why we want to be people that are good at thinking about the game, generally speaking, because it better enables us to make these decisions and to analyze these decisions so we can improve them for the next time. And then that should help you sort of just stay in the moment and just deal with the situation at hand. And also, by the way, another really interesting thing about clutches is this is very similar to anyone who's played a 1v1 game. 1v1 games are way harder from a pressure perspective, way harder, because every single mistake, every single thing that happens is you're directly responsible for. And when you're in a team game, it's like the mob mentality thing. Why do people become retarded when they're in groups of people? One of the reasons is because they have a sense of diminished responsibility. And so this makes, it generally makes things a bit fucked up, and people like the collective is never as intelligent as its constituent parts. As another sort of quote for about mob mentality there. So when you're in that mode, all of a sudden everything rests on you, and you're directly responsible. You have there's way more variables that you have to consider, and all of a sudden everything becomes very, very different. So that's another thing to think about there as well. So there you go. Decision making, preparedness is very important. So another thing that goes with this is a mental checklist. So generally speaking, if you don't have a a very specific plan of how to play certain positions, you can create like mental checklists, which is kind of like a dot to dot, like an A to Z of like everything I have to do in this round. So essentially, and these can be things that are pre-decided as well. So as you can look at specific timings, you can use it at specific timings to check the mini map potentially, or you can I always check the mini map before this happens, or I always in this timing of this kind of a round with this kind of a buy, I'm going to do this, I'm going to have this, and just having like some kind of a checklist of a to-do list in that sense can be very helpful. In some games it's easier than others. Obviously, like in a game like StarCraft or something similar, you have you're consciously concerned with or consistently concerned with your build order, so it literally is a step by step. In a game like Quake, there's situations where like you get a power up and you're thinking the objectives of this power up is this, and this, and I always have to have this and this. And so then you just run through that list and you don't really think about a lot of the other variables, because there's lots of situations where you shouldn't be thinking about the variables. So let's think about a spot in CS like that. It's like when you're rushing into a bomb site. If you're in a certain position in the rush, you have specific jobs and you do those jobs. You don't, and you see this happening in matchmaking all the time, right? Where people are thinking about everything. They have no structure of like understanding of what the fuck's going on. So instead of actually just making a decision saying that guy's in front of me, my job is to trade him and to clear, and he's always going to be looking at this spot, so I'm going to be looking at that spot, and that's your checklist, and that's what you're thinking when you're running in a very chaotic situation where information is going like just bombarding your mind. So but what happens is in matchmaking is no one has any of these processes. So a guy runs in, dies, and they freeze up. They just fucking freeze, man. And it's like, look, deer in the headlights, and it's very frustrating to deal with. But that's just them just not knowing how to make the decision. The decision was super clear if they've had thought about it. And but this is the thing, is that most people in matchmaking scenarios, like they're thinking about 100%. Like I'm talking about the bad players. So bad players tend to think about 100% of things. When you get good, you don't have to think about 100% of things, because you know already what information, what data is important in this sort of model that you created as to how to approach these specific scenarios. And so by having these sorts of things that you just kind of roll through the motions on, again, that helps to keep you in the sort of subconscious sort of performance-based spaces. At least these are my theories about this. So lastly, one of the things I want to talk about is how we, like this, the way that mistakes are stigmatized in the community, like in the world. So we are human beings, we know this, right? At least I hope that you know that. Presumably you are. I mean, if you're not a human being and you're watching this, you're actually, some other species of animal that has developed some level of consciousness that, we don't understand to be exactly the normal truth from the animal kingdom. Please send me an email. I would be very interested to have a discussion with you about all kinds of things. So anyway, but we're all human beings, so we're completely fallible. We're very fallible, and it's not just that we're fallible, it's that fallibility is expected, or should be expected. But this is the problem, is that it's not expected, is that it's stigmatized, and people try to punish people for that. And we are punishing ourselves emotionally because we're already defying our expectation of reaching success and the potential instant gratification that is response from that, the dopamine hit, the nice little hit of good emotions because you did something good, that you want, that you got that kill or whatever, you won the round for your team, all that kind of stuff. So a situation where you're gonna fuck stuff up. You're gonna fuck stuff up. I cannot stress this enough. You're gonna fuck stuff up, and that's completely normal. The way you have to think about mistakes is that you want to be happy for them, because the more mistakes happen, the more that you can possibly learn from that situation, which will make you a better player, obviously. So that's one way you really need to think about it. But the other thing you need to think about is how mistakes actually affect you emotionally, because if you can find a way to shift your investment, as I often talk about, or whatever it is, to say, I don't care about the mistake. I care about whether I feel like I made the right decision, because after I made the right decision, that's something on the data that I had. you can make a best decision from that data. There is a best decision there, or there's like a 3 best decisions there. So if you make one of those 3, or whatever, if you make the best decision, you can be happy, because your execution, for whatever reason, can always be off. It's a very inconsistent thing, and it can improve over time, but generally speaking, you can't rely on it. You can't control it very specifically. So this is something that we need to like get out of our heads. Fucking stuff up is fine, as long as you learn from it. And the other thing as well that's very important about fucking up is that you control as best as you can your emotional response. So if you feel really awful for fuck ups, that's going to carry over. That's going to compound into more mistakes and more problems in your gameplay. And you have another situation here where actually, if you can actually get to a spot where you can say, okay, well, I feel a tiny bit bad, but fuck it, it just kind of like washes over you. That's fucking awesome, because then the next thing that happens, you're going to have less pressure on yourself. You're going to have less bad emotions floating around. You're going to have a better degree of performance because of how you have handled your emotional response when it comes to mistakes. And that's something to think about. And it's something that a lot of people don't think about. They don't conceptualize, but you need to think about these things, because you'll gain insights. Once you teach your brain that paying attention to something is valuable, you will gain insights over time, where as if you'd never thought that my emotional response, or even if you don't even think about your emotional responses within the game like at all, you'll never gain insights there, because you're never thinking about it. Your brain just does not see that as a valuable thing, and it doesn't look at that as something where I'm going to try to gain some data and see if I can find something that makes sense to me and can help me achieve my objective. So and this is like one other quick thing about how pressure can affect us negatively, which I don't think I mentioned earlier. Very quickly, as we close things off here, the way pressure also affects you, again, like in poker, similarly, if you're losing loads of money, you have that investment to the money, so you kind of tighten up. And this is the same thing. Like you're playing not to lose as opposed to playing to win. It's a very common idea, and it's where you're not going to make the best play because you're afraid. You're afraid that of the outcome. Essentially, you're afraid that if you make this play, you'll lose the game, because it's the game winning or losing round, it's the game winning or losing play, or even something less minor but equally as impactful. If I die in this clutch, then this 1v1 clutch, then they've won the force buy, and then we get reset. Right? You're in a situation where you have to make the best play, and this is another idea why we have to say, we have to find a way to make sure that all these emotions and all this pressure doesn't fuck up our decision-making process. It's another reason why the mental checklist, the preparedness, is very important, because you have to at all times know what the best play is, and you have to make that best play. And you don't want to adjust the best play because you're like, I'm not really hitting my shots that much at the moment. What you can do is you can say, I don't want to AWP because right now I've had a couple bad spots with the AWPing. I'm going to look at a different approach. Yes, that is fine. But if you're going to AWP, you have to take the right decisions with the AWP. And that is very important to understand. So I think I covered more or less everything I wanted to say about pressure there. So I hope this is, in some way interesting or informative, and that, you guys enjoy the return. It's been a while. But yeah, hope you enjoyed.